Hi, everyone. I want to thank you for joining me today and excited to talk to you about the federal methane regulatory policy and what we expect under the Trump administration. I want to get started by telling you a little bit about CUBE. Share my screen. Okay, CUBE is a leading continuous monitoring provider with over 6,000 deployments in every U.S. basin, as well as in over 9 countries. CUBE works with over 80 operators, and not just in the oil and gas exploration and production space, but also for landfills, biogas, as well as utilities. And CUBE is approved by regulators in Canada, and we have over 60 employees in Canada, as well as Houston, Midland, and Denver, and we're backed by leading energy investors. CUBE's headquarters is in Calgary, and we have offices in Midland and Houston. Okay, so I want to get started by providing a summary of what my talk will entail today. First, the content. I will explain the current federal oil and gas methane regulations, and I'll be covering U.S. federal regulatory policy only, not state regulations or international frameworks, although there is a lot of activity in this space currently as well. I'll provide the status of the litigation on the federal methane rules and expected changes in U.S. methane policy under the Trump administration and a unified Congress. And just a caveat that this is the expected changes are speculation, in some cases my opinion, and we don't have any certainty on this, of course, until President Trump takes office and begins implementing change. So just please keep that in mind. And the takeaways, the rules are still in flux and subject to change, even final rules. There is a process currently undergoing called the petition for reconsideration process, and that is where groups will file or have filed petitions with the EPA asking EPA to revise certain portions of the federal rules. Those are ongoing. Also, the petition for review. This is filed as well in the early stages of a rule being finalized, and this preserves the right to litigate later if the reconsideration process does not play out favorably for the petitioner. So those are ongoing, and that's one reason that the rules are subject to change, as well as anything President Trump may do and order his EPA to do as well. CUBE is advocating for changes to other large release events. This is a new category in Subpart W, Greenhouse Gas Reporting Rule. Continuous monitoring has gained attention by regulators. It is named in many of the rules and included, and CUBE will continue advocacy and have a seat at the table in federal policymaking under the Trump administration. Okay, so the agenda, I will review the federal oil and gas methane rules in play. I will provide a summary of the Inflation Reduction Act and specifically the Methane Emission Reduction Program in the IRA. We call that the MERP. And last, political outlook under the Trump administration and a Republican trifecta. I'll discuss near-term actions and then what the Trump administration will consider in regard to methane and also potential regulatory and litigation steps to watch for. So first, I want to lay out the oil and gas regulatory landscape. As many of these are the 3 main rules that I will discuss and that really make up the oil and gas methane regulatory policy at this time. And it is the New Source Performance Standards, Quad OB, as well as the Emission Guidelines, Quad OC. And these were promulgated under the authority of the Clean Air Act, and EPA finalized these earlier this year. Next is the Subpart W Greenhouse Gas Reporting Rule and the Waste Emission Charge. Now, both of these were promulgated by EPA, but under the authority of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the legislation that Congress passed a few years ago. And these 3 rules, EPA talks about them. The EPA wants them to be consistent, not redundant, not duplicative, and EPA wants these to work together. And so that is one of the challenges that EPA and operators are having is working with all three of these rules at the same time, since they are all final rules. And then last, the Department of Interior Bureau of Land Management Waste Prevention Rule. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this rule, but I just wanted to flag it because it is a final rule for federal lands, and it does allow the use of alternative technology, and it specifically mentions continuous monitoring. And just wanted to flag that for operators who have operations on federal lands. And then just a quick overview of the balance of power with the three branches of government. Congress, as I'm sure, passes laws, and the executive branch's agencies, such as the EPA, implements these through the regulations, but Congress still has oversight on the agencies. And then the Supreme Court decides if the laws Congress passes are constitutional. They decide if EPA exceeds its statutory authority and or if the rules are arbitrary and capricious. That's the standard by which a lot of rules are challenged, if they're arbitrary or capricious. And then how much deference an agency has when interpreting the law. And this is really important right now because you may have heard about the Chevron deference being overruled, and I will touch on that a little later. So first, I'll give a very quick overview of EPA's new source performance standard, Quad OB. This rule was finalized earlier in the year, and it was effective on May 7th of this year. It regulates methane and volatile organic compounds and applies to all new, modified, and reconstructed upstream and midstream oil and gas facilities after December 6th of 2022. So that's the applicability date, after December 6th, 2022. And this rule requires performance standards for many sources: storage tanks, pneumatic controllers, reciprocating compressors, among others. That's just a few, but I want to focus on the advanced monitoring technology piece, since that is the primary focus for CUBE. And so in this rule, EPA has streamlined the alternative monitoring technology process, and they allow operators to apply to use advanced monitoring technologies, including a combination of technologies, to identify leaks. And EPA has determined an equivalency to the default quarterly optical gas imaging requirements that includes a sensitivity frequency matrix for periodic screening and a rolling average and action level chart and requirements for continuous monitoring. And once alternative technologies are approved by EPA for operators to use them to comply with Quad OB and C, operators can also use these technologies to comply with Quad OA as well. And Quad OA, the effective date is after September of 2015. So that's really important. And this would be just in the interim until Quad OC replaces Quad OA. So that's just something to keep in mind. That was a real win, I think, for industry in these rules, getting an alternative technology to apply to Quad OA as well, once it's approved for Quad OB and C. And CUBE submitted its application to EPA for acceptance as an alternative technology on July 25th of 2024. EPA is required under the rules to respond to applicants within 270 days and let them know if their technology is approved or not. And EPA has told us that they are still in line with that time frame, and they will meet that time frame. So industry groups have filed petitions for reconsideration and petitions for review, asking for technical and legal revisions to Quad OB and C, including review of the matrix for periodic screening. And then a whole host of other issues are in these petitions. I understand that a proposed reconsideration rule has left the White House Office of Management and Budget. So the Biden administration is trying to get that reconsideration proposal out before the end of the term, but there are other reconsideration issues that have been asked for that the Trump administration can take up as well. And then, like I mentioned before, the petition for a review that's been filed by a number of groups preserves the right to litigate in court on these rules as well. Next, EPA's emission guidelines, Quad OC. These were finalized in the same package as the Quad OB, New Source Performance Standards, and they have the same requirements as Quad OB. They also regulate methane and volatile organic compounds, but the difference is the Quad OC regulations are applicable to existing sources, and this is defined as those sources that are constructed before the December 6, 2022 date. And the states must draft a plan at least as stringent as these federal emission guidelines. They can be more stringent, but they have to be at least as stringent. And so states that already have a methane rule in place, such as California, Colorado, or New Mexico, will likely need to revise their rule in accordance with these federal guidelines. And then EPA has oversight authority, and they can approve a state plan, reject it, and if they reject it, they can draft their own federal implementation plan for that state. And in the statute for Quad OC, it's under the Clean Air Act, Section 111D. There is some language that states that there's some flexibility on the states complying with these federal emission guidelines based on remaining useful life. And we don't know what that means exactly. There's really no precedent on this, but it's an economic test that maybe for some wells that have a short life left, that there will be some flexibility with the rules, but we really don't know how that will play out. The states will have to deal with the federal EPA on interpreting that language and possibly getting some flexibility for certain sites. And then the timing for Quad OC, the state plans are not due until March of 2026. And then EPA has a time period to approve or deny and issue a federal implementation plan. And then the compliance deadline for the states is not until March of 2029. So there is some time in here and some leeway for states to prepare their plans and to prepare for Quad OC compliance. And the state of Texas has filed a petition for review in the DC Circuit alleging that Quad OB and C is a, quote, unlawful federal overreach that usurps states' rights in establishing emission standards. And they feel that these regulations are too stringent since they are identical to the new source regulations in Quad OB. And so we will have to see how this litigation plays out and what flexibility at all the Trump administration EPA provides for states for Quad OC. So I wanted to note this development back in October. So the Supreme Court, they ruled on states' requests to enjoin or stay Quad OB and C. So the Supreme Court denied the request for an injunction on Quad OB and C pending litigation on the merits. And so the result of that is that these rules remain in effect as the merits of the litigation proceeds. And 24 Republican attorney generals filed this injunction. And you can see the red states are the states against the methane rule. And they are the states that filed for the injunction. And they wanted this rule stayed and put on the back burner until the litigation played out. But the Supreme Court denied that request. And this decision means that the DC Circuit cases will continue to move forward with briefing and final briefs expected by April, as well as the reconsideration process that's happening at the agency level. And of course, all of this is subject to change, to delay under the Trump administration. We will just have to wait and see. So now I want to talk about the super emitter program. And this is a program in the final Quad OB and C rules. And the super emitter is defined as any event that is located at or near an oil and gas facility and that is detected using remote detection methods and has a quantified emission rate of 100 kilogram an hour or greater of methane that's detected by a third party. So the super emitter program is really detections by third parties. And in the rule, EPA retroactively added this to Quad O and Quad OA, but it functionally covers all sites because EPA has authority under the Clean Air Act Section 114 to investigate emissions that it finds, or that, in this case, third party finds and notifies EPA. EPA will notify the operator, and then the operator has 15 days to submit their super emitter program report. All sites, once validated, will be on EPA's public portal. And one thing to note is that the third-party entities must be certified and use a method that has been approved under the alternative technology guidelines of Quad OB and Quad OC. And so it can't just be anyone. It has to be a third party that has been approved. And I know a few third party entities have already applied to EPA to be certified to detect emissions under this program. And one benefit of a continuous monitoring system is operators can use approved continuous monitoring to time bound the super emitter event. And so instead of having to, so if a super emitter is found, instead of having to default to 91 days, which could be the last time a quarterly optical gas imaging survey was conducted on the site, an operator can use their continuous monitoring data to define a start time to that super emitter event, which could greatly reduce the emissions that would then need to be reported to EPA, reported under the Subpart W Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. And as I said, this information would be on the EPA's portal as well. And so this is an opportunity for CUBE to help operators detect super emitters at their sites before a third party finds them. Next, in Quad O, B, and C, I'll just quickly mention the No Identifiable Emission Standard. And this is a standard that EPA included in the rule for closed vent systems. Closed vent systems, they must be designed and operated to capture and route all gases, vapors, and fumes to a process or to a control device and comply with an emission limit of NIE, which is essentially a zero emission standard. And so if emissions are found from covers or closed vent systems, an operator would essentially be out of compliance. However, if the operator has a continuous monitoring system, such as CUBE, at their site, the leak from a cover or closed vent system is not considered an emission or a violation if it is under the action level. And the action level, those are the same rolling averages and action levels that are included in the alternative technology section of these rules for continuous monitoring. And in addition to that, even if the emissions exceed the action level, it's still considered a no identifiable emission and not a compliance violation unless a follow-up by Method 21 or OGI or AVO indicates otherwise. And so this is a difficult standard for compliance for operators. And so because of that, industry groups included this section, this provision of the rule, in their petition for reconsideration, asking for EPA to revise this section, give the operators a little more flexibility. And EPA responded that they would like to continue discussions on this issue. So they didn't accept this issue as a formal reconsideration topic, but they did commit in writing to further discussions with industry on this topic. So more to come on that. But in the meantime, the super emitter program and this NIE standard in the rules is in the rules that are finalized as written, and operators should be complying with these rules as written until they are changed. So now I'm going to switch gears away from Quad O, B, and C and move now to the Inflation Reduction Act. So this legislation was passed in August of 2022. It was signed into law by President Biden. The IRA is huge, but the IRA has one section called the Methane Emissions and Waste Reduction Incentive Program for Petroleum and Natural Gas Systems. And this was actually added to the Clean Air Act under a new Section 136. And this is the MERP program. And in this program, Congress expressly affirmed EPA's authority to do three things: to first revise Subpart W, the greenhouse gas reporting rule, to make the rule to be based more on empirical data and to more accurately reflect the total methane emissions from applicable facilities, to implement Congress's waste emission charge, and to oversee DOE funding to accelerate to a no and low emitting oil and gas technologies, including funds for methane monitoring. And so first, I'll discuss the requirement to revise Subpart W. In May of this year, EPA finalized these revisions to the Subpart W greenhouse gas reporting rule, and this new methodology is effective for the reporting year of 2025, so coming up. And Subpart W was finalized back in 2011, and the greenhouse gas emissions reporting applies to the entire oil and gas value chain. So these are just one of many revisions that have been made to Subpart W, and these, like I said, were mandated by Congress by the Inflation Reduction Act. And the reasoning, like I said, was to include more empirical data so that the reportable emissions better reflect the methane emissions at an operator site, and even more importantly, the waste emissions, because this ties directly into the waste emission charge that I'll talk about next. And this rule also adds some new source categories, such as the other large release events that I touched on earlier, and allows for direct emission measurements for certain sources. So not for the whole rule, but just for certain sources for equipment leaks and natural gas pneumatic devices. But there are still emission factors in Subpart W, but there is the option to do more direct measurement. And EPA released a request for information on the potential expanded use of advanced technologies for methane emissions quantification in Subpart W, as well as for MSW landfills. And the response deadline was November 27th. CUBE responded to this, as well as a number of other entities. And if anyone's interested, those comments are included in the docket for this request for information on regulations.gov. So you can read responses there. So we expect to hear back from EPA at some point on this request for information, but there's no deadline. We really don't know if this will amount to new rulemakings to include more advanced technology or not, but it's something to keep an eye out for. Next, I'll talk about Subpart W's other large release events. And so this new section in Subpart W has been problematic for operators and technology vendors alike. And what it says is that an operator with an on-site monitoring technology capable of identifying emission events with an instantaneous rate over 100 kilogram an hour of methane that are not accounted for in other Subpart W sources must report the emissions for the duration of the event. And this is also applicable to sources that are included in Subpart W, but where the emission event is 100 kilograms an hour greater than the emissions already estimated for that source category. And in addition to self-reporting, this also is where events reported by third parties to EPA under the super emitter program in Quado B and C must be reported into Subpart W as well. And so even though this is a self-reporting provision, it seems like the impact will be minimal. Operators, as they make facility improvements, these events should become less likely. As I said, continuous monitoring will allow an operator to time bound any emissions at that site so that they don't have to default to the 91 days. And again, this reduces the operator's liability under the waste emission program. And as compared with the risk of a third party identifying a super emitter event, being proactive can minimize overall cost and reputational risk. And because this is a problematic issue, industry groups have filed petitions for reconsideration on this issue, as well as petitions for review. And CUBE specifically is advocating for a minimum duration to determine exceedance of the 100 kilogram an hour threshold rate, for EPA to specify a minimum duration so that there's some guidelines around when actually that threshold is exceeded. And our recommendations are included in Independent Petroleum Association of America's Subpart W petition for reconsideration. So there'll be continued discussion on this topic with the new administration. So now I'm going to move to the waste emission charge. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this, but it is applicable to facilities which are defined as basins that report more than 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year to Subpart W, and that's the same definition for Subpart W applicable facilities as well. And the thresholds are 0.2% for production and 0.05% of natural gas sent to sale from the facility. So those are the methane intensity threshold. So if you're over that threshold in your emissions, those are considered the waste emissions. And the waste emission charge, you can see, was supposed to start for this year and 2025 and 2026. And there are netting, there is netting that is allowed, as well as some exemptions. But they're not, the exemptions are not very workable. There's a lot of problems with them. EPA did finalize this rule just last month, implementing this waste emission charge. And the first payment is due not until September 2nd of 2025. And so there is some leeway there. So there is time for Congress and or the Trump administration to make some changes to this program. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. And we do expect that the revisions to Subpart W will increase the reportable emissions than what they previously would have been before these Subpart W revisions were put into place. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears to the political outlook. So reversing rulemakings and laws. And the EPA is under the executive branch, of course. So under the Trump administration, and the new EPA administrator is Lee Zeldin. And the Republicans also gained control of both houses of Congress, so the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then you have the Supreme Court over here as the third branch. And this is really important because having the administration and both houses of Congress being in the same party, they're likely to be able to actually make some changes to some of these rules and laws that are on the books. But it's still a challenge, but they have a more of an opportunity to do this. And the only ways, though, for a new administration to reverse final rules is they can reverse the rules through subsequent notice and comment rulemaking. So President Trump, in an executive order, could require EPA to repeal and replace certain rules. But that executive order does nothing. President Trump cannot get rid of these rules, cannot change them with just the stroke of a pen. He can just ask his EPA to take this on. But the EPA, it takes a very long time to modify rules, and the EPA would have to, like I said, go out, put these rules out for notice and comment, take comments, respond to them, do the cost benefit analysis, all of that in order to have a new rulemaking. So it cannot be undone easily at all. The new administration could decline to defend agency rules. Like I mentioned, the lawsuits that have been filed, the new EPA and DOJ could just decline to defend these agency rules. We'll see how that plays out if that scenario happens. And last, congressional revocation via the Congressional Review Act can undo rules, but this is only applicable for rules finalized 60 legislative days before a new Congress. So it's a very narrow window. The waste emission charge rule does fall into that window, but the waste emission charge was required by Congress in the IRA. So just getting rid of that rule still does not change the obligation that is in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so it would have to be changed in the law by Congress as well in order for the waste emission charge to really effectively go away. But I'll talk about that just a little bit more in the next slide. And then the only way Congress can repeal a federal law, such as the Inflation Reduction Act, is to get 51% of both houses to pass legislation repealing it, and a president who won't veto the repeal. So since we have the president and Congress of the same party, it is likely that something could be done on the IRA, or probably more likely just a small provision of the IRA. So like the methane emission reduction program section of the IRA, or even more specifically, the waste emission charge section of the IRA could be repealed, but leaving the rest of the IRA in place. So next, here are some near-term actions by President Trump and Congress that we expect. And again, these are not certain. We have no idea, but this is just what is expected could happen. The Trump administration could withdraw the EPA's power plant rule and electric vehicle mandates. And again, that would be the Trump administration ordering its EPA to withdraw this power plant rule. The EPA would have to do that through a rulemaking. In the LNG pause and clear outstanding permits, we expect strong support for new gas generation for AI data centers and manufacturing. Many Republicans or all Republican states are all in for carbon capture and sequestration, hydrogen and nuclear. And there's a lot of money in the Inflation Reduction Act that's been given to a lot of red states. And so we're hearing that a lot of these Republican states do not want the Inflation Reduction Act to go away. They like the funding they're getting under this. And so we expect for much of the Inflation Reduction Act to stay in place. But like I mentioned before, certain sections can be carved out and repealed, such as the waste emission charge. We expect President Trump to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. He's appointed Chris Wright, who was formerly the CEO of Liberty Energy, or currently, and as DOE Secretary, and Doug Burgum, the North Dakota governor, as DOI Secretary, and these are big proponents of oil and gas. And then we expect consideration of industry's petitions for reconsideration on Quad OBC and Subpart W. Like I mentioned, even though we understand that EPA has responded to some reconsideration issues, and we understand that proposed rule has left the White House Office of Management and Budget and might be finalized soon, the new administration can reconsider additional issues in Quad OB and C, and industry groups and CUBE and others can work with the administration on that, as well as changes to Subpart W as well. And then Congress, we know that they will pass a budget reconciliation bill early in the year. There might be more than one budget reconciliation bill. And the waste emission charge portion of the Inflation Reduction Act may be repealed in this bill. That is what we're expecting. And then EPA's waste emission charge rule is at risk of repeal per Congress's authority under the Congressional Review Act, since it's in that narrow window, since it was just finalized last month. But like I mentioned before, even if Congress repeals EPA's waste emission charge rule and does away with that, there's still the obligation in the Inflation Reduction Act for EPA to implement a waste emission charge. So it's really important for Congress to repeal it in the law itself for it to truly go away. So consideration for the Trump administration's approach to methane. And these are just things that we think the Trump administration has to consider, has to weigh when looking at Quad O, B, and C, Subpart W, as well as other methane rules out there. Domestic and international market demand for differentiated gas. And in this category, the forthcoming European Union methane rule is really important. And this rule applies to oil and gas and coal producers in the EU, as well as any imports that go into the EU, to have methane monitoring, reporting, and verification, as well as eventually, and by 2030, the EU will put on a methane intensity cap for all imports coming in. So this is really applicable as well, since we expect the Trump administration to lift the LNG pause. So any exports that go to the EU will eventually need to be validated and verified of their methane intensity. And so that's really important, that something to keep an eye on, that Trump administration will have to consider. The market driver to limit leaks of a valuable product, of course, as operators find and fix leaks, that's more gas back in the sales pipe to sell. The continued market demand for advanced technologies to detect emissions and get away from the extensive manpower of the handheld optical gas imaging camera. U.S. energy dominance, as President Trump has said many times, wants the U.S. to have energy dominance. State regulation. The federal regulations potentially change. We expect some states to ramp up their own individual state methane regulations to make up for that. Increased emissions information. Subpart W revisions have really asked for trying to get more empirical data, more direct measurement. This was asked for by Congress, and so that's going to keep expanding. So there'll be more emissions information. The government will have more information to work with. Of course, investor and shareholder pressure. And then, like I mentioned, any regulatory rollback will take time. President Trump cannot do any changes to the current climate rules for oil and gas or other industries with the stroke of a pen. It has to go through a rulemaking process, and that takes an enormous amount of time. And then Chevron has been overruled. And this is the Chevron deference that you have probably heard a lot about. And just real quickly, what the Chevron deference did is that it allowed, if a statute was ambiguous or Congress was silent on an issue when they were writing that law, the agencies, so such as the EPA, they were able to have discretion to interpret the meaning of that statute as long as their interpretation was reasonable. The case earlier this year, Loper versus Bright, overruled the Chevron case. And so Chevron deference is no longer available. So basically, if a statute is silent or ambiguous, the agency cannot use their discretion to interpret what Congress meant. This would have to go to the courts to interpret. So of course, there's some flexibility and leeway there, but that's really important because it will reduce some of the pendulum swinging from administration to administration in both ways, just as it would have limited the Biden administration's all-in approach to climate policy. It could also inhibit, in a way, and limit the Trump administration's all-in approach to climate deregulation. So we'll just have to see how this plays out. But that was a real important ruling, Supreme Court ruling that happened earlier this year. And then last, the regulatory and litigation steps to watch for. There could be action on the EPA administrator's 2009 greenhouse gas endangerment finding. And this is where EPA said that the basket of 6 greenhouse gases that included methane and CO2, among others, endanger public health and welfare. But for the EPA to try to undo that and reverse that would be an enormous lift. And I just don't think that there's time and the new administration has the bandwidth to take on something like this. But that is a possibility. Congressional action on the waste emission charge via the Congressional Review Act. Like I mentioned, Congress can undo the waste emission charge rule, and President Trump cannot veto that, and then that can go away. And or the waste emission charge being repealed from the actual IRA in the budget for reconciliation bill. And that is more important, that latter piece, for it to actually go away in the statute. Treatment of Biden and Congress's Congressional Review Act on prior Trump EPA Quad A rules. And this refers to when President Trump was in office previously, he put out something called the methane policy rule, and he attempted to remove methane as a regulated pollutant in Quad A. And this was done late in the administration. And the new Congress, once President Biden got in office, they used their Congressional Review Act authority to undo this rule. And when they undid that rule, that kept methane as a regulated pollutant in Quad A. But also, when Congress undoes a rule under their Congressional Review Act authority, there can never be another rulemaking that's substantially similar unless Congress requires EPA to do or requires another agency to do. And so that substantially similar language has never been litigated. But basically, I think it's safe to say that the Trump administration this time around cannot try to remove methane again from the 111 rules, which is Quad B and Quad C, because like I said, he tried to do that and it was CRA'd, and you can't do that again. So we don't expect that to happen. Motions to the DC Circuit Court on ongoing cases. Like I said, there has been litigation filed through the petition for review process on Quad O, back in the day, Quad A, Quad B, and Quad C. And those cases, those previous ones, and then these on Quad B and C, will likely be put into abeyance while the rules get worked out at the administrative level through the reconsideration process and through any orders that Trump administration gives to EPA. So the litigation will be put on the back burner while the rules are worked out at the administrative level, at the agency level. And then an executive order regarding regulatory rollback, Section 111 state plans and enforcement. Again, Trump in his executive order could mention regulatory rollbacks. Again, it requires notice and comment from the EPA, whole new rulemakings, but Trump can still order that. He can make a comment on the state plans that he wants the states to have more leeway, potentially wanting to open up Quad OC and give the states some more flexibility since those emission guidelines are as stringent as the new source guidelines. And then enforcement. The Trump administration could say that there will be a great deal of enforcement discretion on oil and gas operators, but we'll have to wait and see. So more lax enforcement. And then EPA's approach regarding advanced technology approvals. Cube, as well as a number of other technology vendors, applied to be approved for Quad O, B, and C to be used in lieu of OGI for the rules. And we will have to see how the new EPA handles this. We expect this to move along as scheduled, and we've heard from the EPA that they will meet that 270-day timeframe to give an answer on the applications. The state's Quad OC methane rulemakings, like I said, the states are supposed to be drafting their state plans in accordance with Quad OC right now, and that should continue to move forward. Even if President Trump gives some more leeway, certain states might still want their plans to be as stringent or more stringent. I meant to say. And so that we'll have to see how that continues to move with various states. And then last, the EPA career staff generally remains in place from one administration to another. And that's really important because the career staff, they're the ones who write these rules. They understand these rules. But they're also really passionate about them in many cases and feel very strongly about them. And so in a good way, they're well-versed. We can continue to meet with the career staff through administrations, and they understand the rule, they get it. But in another way, it could be difficult to make the same arguments and ask for change because they had a lot of reasoning for putting the rule together in the first place. So it might be difficult for them to move very drastically on the rule. And so we'll just have to see. But of course, they have to respond to the policy staff in DC, kind of telling them, charging them with certain instructions on what to do. And these two last slides, I work in a group called the Environmental and Energy Law Program through the Harvard Law School, and they put these slides together and I modified them a little bit, but these are issues that we've thought about as a group with this Harvard Law Program and that we're all keeping an eye on. And like I said, a lot of uncertainty, but these are things that we're keeping an eye on. So that is the end of my presentation. For more questions or information, please contact me directly via my email or visit CUBE's website, and we're happy to follow up or have someone